Hello and welcome to the Whole Life Election Special. I'm Grace Fielding.
And I'm Paul Woolley, and today we're talking about the Liberal Democrats.
Hello and welcome back. Well, the election campaign continues. It will soon be 4th of July polling day when voting will take place across 650 parliamentary constituencies, each electing a single MP to the House of Commons. Now, we know that to have an overall majority, a political party must win over half of these seats, at least 326 to be precise.
Yes, that's right. 326 is the magic number, the number of seats that Keir Starmer needs to be sure of getting into Downing Street, or Rishi Sunak needs if he is to retain power. If that doesn't happen, either party might attempt to form a coalition government. It was back in 2010 that the Conservatives, under David Cameron, were short of an overall majority and formed a coalition with the Lib Dems. And it is the Liberal Democrats who are the focus of today's podcast. Who are the Liberal Democrats, and how does their tradition and political vision link with the Christian story?
Well, I'm delighted today that we are joined by Tim Farron. Tim was elected MP for Westmorland and Lonsdale back in 2005. He rose to become president of the Liberal Democrats during the coalition. Then in 2015, he succeeded Nick Clegg as party leader, leading the party through the 2016 EU referendum and the 2017 general election, which I'm sure we can all agree is no small feat. In his televised resignation statement following the party's poor performance in that election, he said, "The consequences of the focus on my faith is that I have found myself torn between living as a faithful Christian and serving as a political leader." Despite having resigned as leader, Tim has since remained an active Lib Dem in Parliament. Hello, Tim. Thank you so much for joining us on the Whole Life podcast.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to have you with us today. I think joining from a very busy office in Kendal, is that right today?
Yes, I'm literally in the print room of our office. So if this machine suddenly starts whirring, I apologise. And it's also a bit of a corridor. So anyway, it's a kind of real life.
Exactly, we love it. We love real life here.
Can I correct one thing you said, Grace?
Please.
And this might be, as we know, pride is the gateway sin, and we've got to be careful.
No, go for it.
Nevertheless, I did resign in 2017, and for lots of reasons that are my fault. But also, it wasn't a poor result. We went up from 8 MPs to 12. We increased our standing. It was at least a good away point. So I didn't resign because we hadn't done well. I stepped down because I felt I got myself into a position where I felt that I was either going to have to be a poor leader or a poor Christian. Indeed a backslidden one, because the way I had maybe dealt with the questioning and the way that had been made me, I think, either be in a position where I had to dial down on my faith, say things I didn't believe, in order to give the party a hearing, or else stick to my guns as I wanted to do, and therefore distract all attention away from the party's messaging. And that's essentially why I stepped down. Result was kind of neither here nor there. In fact, the result was good enough probably for me to have hung on if I wanted to. I didn't want to. Anyway, but
that's helpful. I'm sure we'll get more into that as we go through the podcast.
Definitely, Tim. It's so good to have you with us. Let's talk about your Christian faith and politics and the connection between the two. How did you get into either of those, Christianity and politics, and which came first? Which led one to the other?
Well, I've interviewed lots of people, as you know, Paul, and I interviewed lots of people who've been called into politics, having been Christians first. And in many ways, I so wish my story was as neat as that. And it isn't. I got involved in politics. I joined the Liberals in my first week or two at sixth form college when I was a 16-year-old, largely because, well, I was already a member of Shelter and Greenpeace. I joined Shelter in a very emotional moment because I'd accidentally watched Kathy Come Home when I was 14 and it made me cry. And so I joined Shelter. And I joined Greenpeace because I was moved by the situation I saw environmentally and wanted to do something about that. I joined the Liberals because I was doing economics O-level and therefore I knew everything. And I came to the conclusion that I was a Liberal, that the Liberals were the party for awkward people, that I was an awkward kid, and also that I broadly agreed with their compassionate, idealistic, but pragmatic approach to the economy. All the talk in the 80s was about, hard left socialism or monetarist free market economics. I thought these were both systems being imposed upon people rather than thinking about people first. So that's why I joined the Liberals. And 2 years later, to my great surprise, I became a Christian. And that story is essentially my mum was seconded from Preston Poly, as it was in those days, as a lecturer. Now it's the University of Central Lancashire, to a college in Singapore. And we were a very poorly travelled family. I'd only been abroad once in my whole life. At that point, I went across to Singapore with my mum, basically the summer after my A-levels, and we were plonked in a house previously lived in by other lecturers at that college who were Christians. They'd left their books behind. I got bored. I read them. I thought, flipping heck, it's true. And I became a Christian.
That's an extraordinary story. So 2 very formative influences, Kathy Come Home, which remains one of those films, doesn't it? That is so framed and formed so many people. And then your experience in Singapore and those books that then led you to discover Christianity and grow, I guess, in your understanding of that too. You talked at the top about your resignation and what led you to that. What have you learnt, would you say, since your resignation as party leader? What have you learnt in terms of integrating your Christian faith with your politics? Do you think the challenge that you described back then remains the same?
Yes. So I think the first thing to say is that it's important for us as Christians to remember that we're always going to be countercultural individuals. We can do it graciously, we can do it lovingly, we can be those who turn the other cheek. We should never be those who whine about being cancelled. But nevertheless, we are going to jar with the culture sometimes. And so it's being prepared for that. So when people say, there's a glass ceiling for Christians in politics, I'd say, well, there kind of is in every walk of life, because we're going to jar with our culture. We shouldn't do it in an aggressive way. We shouldn't do it in a bellicose way. We should do it in a gracious way, but we are going to jar with the culture. I think the thing I would learn is you need to be prepared to lose. And that's a funny thing to say as someone who's, stood in my busy office at the moment doing everything I can to win. And there's no harm in that. But it's a very good thing to be ambitious for your community, for what you believe in, and to try to win. But I saw in Kate Forbes a far better way of dealing with the issue than I did. I think my problem was I was surrounded by lovely and good and committed people, most of whom who didn't share my faith. And then in my church, wonderful Christian people who were not all that plugged into politics. And so I guess the people around me didn't see the full picture. And there was me in the middle of it's on my own in this Venn diagram. And that's my fault for not surrounding myself and not being, not talking people who are with me through what was likely to come. And the thing about Kate is that she just opened the closet on day one. And it must have been a really, really tough time for her. And many of us were praying for her. And I think it has proven, now you can argue it cost her the leadership of the SNP. I kind of think being evasive would have cost the leadership of the SNP. And she lost by that cursed ratio, 52-48, didn't she? And now she's Deputy First Minister. And you wouldn't bet against her having the top job at some point. So, I mean, you've just, what Kate demonstrated was I'm sure she wasn't fearless, but an apparent fearlessness when it came to the possibility that you might not achieve your political ambition by being upfront with people immediately and then seeing where it takes you.
Interesting. We'll talk in a moment about the particularities of the Lib Dems, but in general terms, to what extent do you think it's possible to be a leader or even a member, perhaps say an elected member of one of the mainstream political parties and be a faithful Christian? I mean, clearly that is what you're seeking to do now, though not as leader. I mean, how would you kind of sum that up or frame that for us?
I think fundamentally politics is about service. We know, don't we, if we're Christians, that we aren't charged with transforming the world and making it perfect. We are not told either to bury ourselves away and achieve nothing. And so we are given this great I suppose, a mission, if you like, to serve those who we're given responsibility for. So I increasingly see politics as service, as a way of doing good for and to others, using the influence that I might have on behalf of those who have little or none, and being, and then also hopefully acting with integrity in the public square and being a witness, and also recognizing that politics is a mission field. It's full of people seeking a better world one way or another. It's also full of people, there I say it without wanting to sound totally negative, who are going to end up being disappointed, because politics is, when you have it as your ultimate thing, it will crush you. It will crush you, because things can only get better. Well, those flags only wave for so long, and then the rubber hits the ground, and suddenly you are faced with reality, and you can't do all the things you wanted to do. Events happen, and so on. And so, being able to hold out to people genuine, ultimate hope is a wonderful blessing, and it's a thing. So, if I am returned to Parliament, I will be one of the 4 co-chairs of Christians in Parliament, and an amount of what I will be seeking to do is just to help with the fellowship of Christians across parties, across Parliament, outside of MPs, alongside other people within the parliamentary community, staff, and everybody else. And so I feel that's a very worthwhile thing to do. I think, just to go back to what you were saying about the extent to which the two can be married, I think we just need to remember, without being belligerent about it, as Christians, we will always be part of a counterculture, and we need not to get angry about that. And the danger is that I see, obviously in the States, but you see some of it in the UK as well, of people kind of weaponizing Christianity as one of the kind of badges of national identity. I think that's dangerous. In fact, I'd even go so far as saying it's heretical.
Tim, it's so interesting, before we get into the kind of nitty-gritty of the Liberal Democrat Party, just to hear some of your story and how that's shaped the way that you've led over the years. And I was really struck by that, the analogy you used of the kind of the Venn diagram of, having sort of lovely Christians on this side, people in politics, and then feeling like the kind of, I think in your words, the sort of the one alone in the middle. And I think actually just hearing that, and the fact that actually that's, in some ways, I suppose in that moment, I'd imagine there was a sense of, well, if I'm the only one in the middle, I suppose I've got to do something about it. Thank you so much for...
It's just, the only thing I throw in there is my advice to Christians getting into politics now is always don't be like that. And so always be fellowshipped, never be a coal out of fire. But also, it's not that every Christian in your circle needs to share your politics. But let's say you've got a dozen people who are your key campaign team. 3 or 4 of them ought to be Christians. Take some people need to be on your journey all the way, and join you in the centre of that Venn diagram, so you're not on your own. And so I would say the only person to blame for my solitary position there is me. And I don't blame any of those people around me. They're all lovely people doing their best.
Of course.
But that's my advice that I would give, and indeed already have given, to people aspiring to lead and indeed to any political career.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Perhaps we could spend a moment just talking about the origins of the Liberal Democrats. The party was founded in 1988 and is a kind of merger of 2 parties and political traditions, one being the Social Democrat Party and the other being the Liberal Party. So I wonder if you could give us kind of a brief whistle-stop history of those traditions, and then maybe talk a bit to sort of what extent do you feel like these have been shaped by Christian tradition, and maybe even the contribution of Christians along the way?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, obviously, yes, the Liberal Democrats, or to give us our original full title, the Social and Liberal Democrats, was formed in 1988. I was there. I was an 18-year-old. I joined the Liberal Party in 1986. So the back end of the rather entertaining period of time where there was the Liberal SDP Alliance, which fought 2 elections, 83 and 87. The Liberal Party came to be in the early part of the second half of the 19th century. And essentially, at its helm were evangelical Christians. If you were to look back at the time of the day, at that period, women couldn't vote, working class men couldn't vote. Unless you were Anglican and male, you kind of had no access to the high echelons of society at all. And so the Liberal Party basically was the party of the mercantile classes, and the non-landed people, but especially those who fought for religious liberty. The overwhelming majority of people, those people would have been very low church, evangelical Christians of one kind or another. And obviously William Ewart Gladstone very much, embodied that. And it's not that everybody in the Liberal Party was a Bible-believing Christian, but certainly the default position would be. Now, as the 19th century went on and the franchise gets widened, we end up into the 20th century. There's all sorts of theories about, whether Labour overtaking the Liberals after the First World War was inevitable. I don't think it was at all. I think the Liberals were fractured during the First World War, and the franchise was open to all men over 21 in 1918, and I think all propertied women over 30. So there's a massive expansion in the franchise, most of whom were people who had no kind of family tradition of voting. Just at the moment, the new, fresh Labour Party were in an attractive-looking position, and the Liberal Party looked like a basket case fighting itself. I think if that hadn't been the case, we'd be more like Canada today, with the Liberal Party being the main alternative to the Tories and the Labour Party being a good, solid third party. But I think that's what happened. But the Labour Party also will claim its roots from Methodism, trade union movement and Methodism. So great, strong Christian roots to both of those traditions. The Social Democratic Party really came out, I suppose, the fallout within the Labour Party after the first European referendum in the 70s, where a lot of the pro-Europeans felt a bit beleaguered by the increasing leftward shift and anti-European, anti-NATO position of the Labour leadership. And then in 1981, a group of, I think, 27 or 28 Labour MPs defected to form the new Social Democratic Party. And immediately they were led by the Gang of Four, Roy Jenkins being kind of the head of them, Shirley Williams, Bill Rogers, David Owen being the others. And very swiftly, the SDP went into an alliance with the Liberal Party. It was on 52% in the opinion polls. And then General Galtieri invaded the Falkland Islands. And the bubble was burst and Margaret Thatcher became popular again. And the rest is history. The alliance did really well. It got 26% of the vote in the 83 general election. Wow. A bit less well in 87. And then the two parties merged. I mean, my line very much, I think the party fits together well. I think my line is that in the UK, every Liberal is a Social Democrat. But not every Social Democrat is a Liberal. And what I mean by that, so to be a Social Democrat is a person who believes, I would say, in a mixed economy, that you can enhance liberty by having greater level. We're not socialists, but we believe there should be state ownership of key sections of the economy, obviously health and education, but other things as well, whilst also supporting a strong, thriving market economy as well. But the Labour Party, which is broadly a social democratic party, is not instinctively liberal. So you'll see from my perspective how equivocal they can be on issues to do with asylum, for instance, and on civil liberties. And I think that if we get a Labour government in a few weeks' time, one of the jobs of the Liberal Democrats will be to tug the Labour Party away from some of its more authoritarian instincts. Not to say that there aren't areas where we will have some commonality with them. There we are. We got to 2024. That's not bad, was that? That's 170 years.
Indeed. So across the different political parties, we often speak about this kind of idea of a vision for society. So kind of in a nutshell, what would you describe as the Lib Dem vision for society?
Well, it's not to impose some human ideology on everybody, which I see too much of, but to believe everybody is equal and is of equal value. Absolutely, by the way, is a Christian-sourced belief also. But therefore, freedom is critical. But to be a liberal rather than a libertarian means that you've then got to make difficult decisions. If you're a libertarian, everything goes, and there's aspects of the right of the Conservative Party, the Reform Party. It's there should be no constraints, do what you like. We don't think that. The John Stuart Mill maxim is always that I am free up until my freedom impinges upon your freedom. And that means you've actually got to make judgments. It's much harder to be a liberal than it is to be a libertarian. Libertarian's easy, just do what you like. But to be a liberal, you've got to make judgments. And so we believe, therefore, that the state does some things well, and having a referee is really important. Free markets are important, but free markets that are unrefereed are never free. They end up with all the power being concentrated in the hands of a few who tend to exploit it, humans being humans. And then we also believe that there should be, a basic belief in fairness, that human rights are a real thing, that justice is important, that put it this way, any old fascist can defend the rights of people who are like them, but it takes a liberal to fight for the rights of people who are not like them, and maybe who don't even like them. And I think that's key to it. But also, if you recognise that every individual matters, and that's really an outworking of loving your neighbour, you're going to think that of people who come after you, which is why the environment matters. I'm not somebody, obviously, as a Christian, who worships the planet. I don't. I care about the planet because I think we are commanded to steward it. But I also care about the planet because of the impact on human beings and the human beings that come after us. And loving my neighbour means caring for people who are not even here yet, who I'll never meet.
If we think then about a bit more kind of policy specific in those terms, so which are the kind of key Liberal Democrat policies that you feel like could help deliver that vision of society that you've just described?
Well, a lot of it is about spending money intelligently. There's a nonsense put around that we spend too much on our National Health Service. Actually, if you look at what we spend on our health service divided per capita, we spend less in the UK on health and social care than most equivalent countries. We might spend it more fairly through a system which is free at the point of use, and we must keep that. But we don't spend as much as the States. We don't spend as much as France. Let's not kid ourselves that that's the case. And so actually spending more on our health service, particularly unlocking primary care, supporting social care, and a range of other areas, like making sure people can be treated for cancer sooner, so they're more likely to survive, more likely to go back to work. There's obviously a clearly obvious compassionate and moral argument for that. But what I increasingly find out, there's an economic case for it as well. The number of people not working or not paying taxes and not being fully economically functional because of their health situation, because they're waiting 18 months for an operation, or because they were delayed in their cancer treatment to the extent that they weren't able to get better, be well enough in order to work again, it's ridiculous. So you start by being intelligent, by making competent decisions based upon what really works, rather than being fixated on a belief that the state is such a size it should only be smaller. I think the other thing is about being honest about things. I don't think this is a time where we should be lying to the electorate about the wisdom of lots and lots of tax cuts when the public sector is in the state that it's in. That doesn't benefit anybody. And so it's about being honest. It's about being long term. This is, I suppose, probably the biggest complaint I've got about our politics and, potentially our opponents, is how short-termist they are, and how lacking in vision and how lacking in concern for the next 50 years. I mean, Churchill said, didn't he, that democracy is a terrible system. It's just better than the alternatives. I suspect what he meant by it being terrible, it is definitely better than the alternatives, by the way. I suspect what he meant by it being terrible is the fact that democracy breeds short-termism. People just look to the next 4 or 5 years rather than looking to the long term. But I'd say this, that maybe social media and 24/7 media and the culture we're currently in means you're lucky if people are planning 5 years ahead. It's more like 5 minutes. And so I have enough confidence in the electorate and in humanity in general, for all of our flaws, that they can accept policies proposed that may not come to fruition within the term of a parliament, or maybe not in their lifetime, but you start now. And that's why, whatever you think about HS2, the fact that got cancelled is so utterly, utterly depressing. I was out walking the dogs along one of our disused railway tracks in Westmorland yesterday, and it's just a reminder of what we used to be able to do, build big projects and build them for the long term, and how foolish we've been in undoing them, and how short-sighted we are now in doing anything new.
So interesting, Tim. Short-termism does seem to be one of the issues of our age, both individually, but also within our political culture. It'd be so good if we could crack that and really build for the long term beyond the lifetime of a parliament. Of course, there has been a time in recent memory when the Lib Dems have been in government. When you look back at the coalition government, Tim, between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, how do you appraise that? The reason I ask is that I was speaking to someone recently and they said, you know, that coalition government was the best government we've had for a generation. But I rarely come across Lib Dems that are quite as enthusiastic about that. And it seems to me that there's sometimes a bit of embarrassment about that episode. But how do you appraise it?
Yeah, so I think there is, and I think obviously, you know, the electoral consequences of the Liberal Democrats were pretty devastating. We lost nearly 90% of our seats. People who are not prepared to give it more than a second's thought assume this was a political choice for us to become Conservatives. And then there's things like the tuition fees debacle. So there's all sorts of reasons why people feel they need to qualify any kind of positivity they might have about the coalition. But I'm somebody who didn't hold ministerial office and was party president during nearly all the time we were in government, and often acted like a kind of critical friend to the coalition government. But I would absolutely agree. I have had the privilege of living through 5 parliaments, serving in Parliament through 5 parliaments, and without a doubt, it was the best government I've been involved in. It was the one we were involved in, but ignore that for a moment. My first parliament was the end of the Blair-Brown era, which felt totally dysfunctional. It felt like a kind of informal coalition between 2 groups of people who weren't politically different at all. They just didn't like each other. It was ridiculous. After that, you had the Cameron government on its own and the chaos of Brexit, the kind of May 2 years, more chaos of Brexit, and then the plague parliament with 3 prime ministers and lack of integrity and leadership in any kind of direction whatsoever. The great thing about the coalition was that you had people in Parliament, in government together, sharing departments who disagreed. And when they fell out or when they disagreed, it wasn't silly personalities. It was, we just disagree politically. So we think thing A, you think thing C, let's do thing B. And that's how normal adults operate every day. And if you ask civil servants, you know, they will say, by and large, the most functional government, as opposed to dysfunctional government they've served in. I mean, it's possible. I wasn't an MP in '97. It's possible that first 4 years of the new Labour government was probably a good government. It felt like it from the outside. But of my 19 years in Parliament, without a doubt, the coalition was the government that did the best job. And from our point of view, I mean, I got caught out, but it was me saying it, and I got royally told off by Paddy Ashdown for saying it. But at the back end of the coalition, I remember saying to some journalists that I would give us 8 out of 10 for policy and 2 out of 10 for politics. So I thought that actually the things that we did, the pupil premium, thinking about the stuff that we did in protecting benefits, for instance, particularly disability benefits, actually the only government in a generation or more that built any social rented houses, any kind of number. The things that we were able to achieve on an unglamorous nitty-gritty level, we did well. On the politics of it, we got run rings round and paid a big political price.
Interesting. I suppose one of those areas was around the referendum on an alternative voting system.
Yeah.
And that was obviously challenging, wasn't it, for the Lib Dems? Tim, you talked about one of the reasons that you're a liberal and a liberal Democrat is because you don't want to impose a human ideology on other people. That's one of the criticisms that is often levied at the Liberal Democrats is that despite its name, it can be quite illiberal. It can be illiberal in the way perhaps that it privileges secular humanist visions of society over other visions, not least perhaps a Christian vision, and perhaps part of your experience reflects some of that. How would you respond to that anxiety, that criticism? I came across a news piece just in the last week of a candidate who says that he's been deselected as a Lib Dem candidate because of his Christian faith. whatever the detail of that, it read as if there is this sort of intolerance of someone with a Christian faith within the party. So how do you kind of navigate through that?
Yeah, well, so I think there's an issue with Western liberalism that it has in the broadest sense, and that can, cover people in the Conservative Party to people in the Labour Party, Greens, ourselves, the SNP. So in the broadest sense that Western liberalism potentially has eaten itself a bit and is tolerant of everything except stuff it doesn't agree with. That's not very liberal, is it? But I think and I think actually you can argue, I mean, Trump and his supporters are the people most responsible for Trump. Let's not give anybody any excuses. Nevertheless, I think that I'm particularly always reminded by, or go back to the phrase that Hillary Clinton used in 2016 about the basket of deplorables who supported Trump. Now, I'm sure she meant the Ku Klux Klan and people like that supporting Trump. But every blue overalled wearing slightly social conservative person in states up and down the US thought she means me. And people don't win elections if they make it sound like they don't like the electorate. And so there is a danger that there's that sniffiness. And so the point is that every ideology gets, so, the Conservative Party has now been captured by bizarre nationalists and is now no longer really the party of business. Because, to be the party of business, you're going to support markets and trade and pragmatic business decisions rather than, lunatic policies that minimise growth and so on. And the danger is that liberals can also sometimes veer away from the ideals that underpin them. But no, I certainly think it's important that we all recognise that there is no such thing as neutrality. I think there's been a lazy slippage from, let's say, the 60s onwards into thinking that secularism, or more generally, the absence of a faith in a God, is the default position. And it isn't. There is no default position. The absence of faith in a God is still, it entails a worldview. Whether you like it or not, it entails no real, genuine, defendable belief in human rights. Now, lots of atheists will get very cross with me, they do when I say that. But I'm sure there are plenty of atheists who believe in human rights and defend them more bravely than me. But if there's no God, or at least no metaphysical, human rights don't exist. They're a temporary, fashionable thing that we like for now. But why would you die in the ditch for something that will be unfashionable in 20 years' time? It might be a human wrong by then. So I think the idea that secularism, the absence of faith in God, is a neutral position is a nonsense. It doesn't mean that Christianity is neutral either. I believe it's true, and I believe it is. It's the only ultimate thing. Is that there is a God who loves us and created us, to whom we will have to make an account. And if we're trusting in his son Jesus, then our account is paid in full. I think that is ultimately true. I also think that I don't need a privileged position in society to make that case. The idea that we have a Christian country, I don't think that nobody's saved by the constitution of their country. So I'm content for us to, politely argue our place in the public square, and we shouldn't have a privileged position. But it's not liberal to think that atheism should have a privileged position either.
Tim, you mentioned at the start that part of the reason for your resignation was around this kind of sense of compromise about either having to kind of, sacrifice some of your belief and your faith, or sacrifice some of, sort of the party. And I wondered, we've spoken about policy already, but if you could speak a little bit to which, on one hand, Lib Dem policies you see as being resonant with the Christian story, but then perhaps on the other hand, and maybe this is partly what you were alluding to earlier, which policies are less resonant, and that you'd say, potentially you still have that sense of kind of feeling sometimes caught a bit between a rock and a hard place in terms of your faith and the policies.
Well, to deal with the latter first, I think
Sure.
it's in all parties. The danger is when, most political parties are majority non-Christian, because that's how the world is. Now, there may be lots of nominal big Christianity, and but I suppose the challenge in any political party, including the Liberal Democrats, is that we act as though we have all the answers, and that human beings are ultimately capable of sorting everything out. And we'll often say that we have a fundamental belief in the goodness of human beings, which is a lovely thing. It doesn't bear scrutiny. It certainly doesn't bear scrutiny from a biblical perspective, but it doesn't bear scrutiny from a just looking at the news perspective or ever having met any other human being's perspective. But I suppose there is a tendency of Liberals being terribly nice people that we recognise maybe too little how flawed human beings are. But the number one person we need to understand is flawed is ourselves. And the danger from other parties is they're very happy, or other political movements are very happy to see the flaws in all of humanity except themselves and their tribe. I think we're not guilty of that. And so I think in terms of things that I absolutely do think resonate is that belief. And I really do, I think this is fundamental to liberalism, is, you look at the creation account and you look at the universe, this awesome universe being created, spoken into being, which means if you look at the awesome pictures from the James Webb Telescope, all these amazing things we're now seeing, all spoken into existence by the God of the universe, all declared good. And then on one day, these people get made, and they're very good. They're very good because they're made in the image of God. And that is, I would say that ought to be, and I seek for it to be, a major driver of liberalism. It means every single human being on the planet is more awesome than the most awesome thing you've seen in the James Webb Telescope pictures. And that's saying something. And that means they are valuable. That means somebody on a raft in the middle of the channel is precious. That means somebody who thinks the opposite of you on Brexit or Scottish independence is precious. And so I hope that drives liberalism, and I want it to drive liberalism. I hope it also drives not just the way we look at how we spend our money collectively and have our policies nationally. It also ought to inform how we relate to one another. And it goes back to how we can disagree well, how we can be passionate about what we believe and still think the person on the other side of the chamber is a human being deserving of dignity and kindness, even if they show none of that to you.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Well, before we wrap up, Tim, it will soon be polling day, as I'm sure you are more than aware.
41 days. It might be less than that.
There we go, and counting. So this is your moment to give us your pitch, give our listeners your pitch for why people should vote for the Liberal Democrats on the 4th of July. Away you go.
Well, look, first of all, in so much of the country, the Liberal Democrats are the main alternative to the Conservatives. So quite simply, using the rubbish electoral system we've got to remove the Conservative government, the Liberal Democrats will be the powerful vote in many parts of the country. But more importantly than that, we have got a really detailed manifesto which seeks to address some of the big problems we've been talking about social care, about the environment, about being honest about the fact we need to put right our rubbish and broken relationship with Europe so we can trade more freely, the one thing we really could do to tackle the cost of living crisis. So they're honest, long-term policies that will make a difference. If we are going to get a Labour government, it will be a Labour government that will be weak on the environment, as we've already seen, that will be weak on civil liberties, that will be weak on defending the rights of the minority, particularly the oppressed, particularly those who seek asylum on our shores and elsewhere. What this country will desperately need after the next election is Liberals in Parliament who will fight the corner for those who nobody else will fight for.
Brilliant.
Tim, thank you. And Tim, just one final question. In the event that Keir Starmer doesn't quite get the numbers that he needs, would the Lib Dems be willing to form a coalition with either Conservative or Labour? Where do you stand on that?
I mean, I think the answer is you can't think about that this side of an election. And my take is that our job is just to win all the seats we can. And then after the election, you react to the arithmetic that the electorate has thrown at you. But at this stage, you just don't know. I mean, for sure, we are part of the movement to remove a Conservative government. So there's clearly no prospect of that happening.
There we go. Tim, thank you so much. We are so grateful to you for putting time aside, not least in this extremely busy time for you. So thank you. And yeah, we hope that in all that the next few weeks bring, that you you are able to find moments of rest and peace in God. And yeah, it's been so good hearing from you today, and just inspired by everything that you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We really appreciate it, Tim. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thanks, Tim. Well, Paul, what did you think of our conversation with Tim today?
I thought it was really interesting, Grace. I thought a few things. Firstly, it was one of the more philosophical discussions that we've had. It was interesting, his reference to John Stuart Mill and the history of liberalism. And it was interesting, of course, because Mill wasn't a Christian, but an agnostic. And yet, I think Tim would argue that liberalism is so rooted within a biblical tradition. The idea of freedom, albeit freedom within certain moral parameters. So that was really interesting in getting into some of that. But also he was really open, wasn't he? So open and self-effacing about his own personal experience, his political experience. Although at the start wanting to emphasize that the result actually, back when he did resign was a pretty good one. He didn't need to resign off the back of the result. Actually, a lot of the podcast was him talking about mistakes that he'd made. I think the person that we were speaking to is clearly someone who has been shaped by and has learnt from mistakes that he's made. And that was really refreshing. I mean, that's not the sort of thing that we're likely to hear on other platforms, is it? I don't think in the big political interviews with Nick Robinson you're going to get much of that from the party leaders. So really refreshing to hear that. And I thought interesting, I mean, some of the questions we were asking were pretty challenging around the extent to which the Liberal Democrats really are liberal and democratic. But I thought he was both sort of open about that in terms of some of the challenges, but at the same time gave a pretty good account of that. So I thought that was really interesting as well. What were your reflections, Grace?
Yeah, I agree, Paul. I feel like we promised, didn't we, that we'd be giving people something a little bit different through this podcast. And I feel like, as you say, the way that we heard from Tim today was very unique and in a sense, as you say, not going to be the same content that people are getting across kind of different sort of slightly more perhaps public channels. So I thought that was that was really interesting to hear from him. I think a couple of things that struck me. One was just how kind of, I suppose, unapologetic Tim was. I think it was fairly near the start where he spoke about the idea that, as Christians, we should expect and we should be comfortable with the fact that we're going to jar with culture. And I thought that was, in lots of the ways that then Tim unpacked, his various kind of interaction between faith and politics across his career. It was very clear that that's something that he really lives out. That actually, I mean, he himself, didn't he? As he rightfully, and I'm glad he did, corrected me at the beginning, resigned over this kind of tension between his faith and politics. And actually, I feel like if that's not jarring with culture in itself, I think you'd have very few politicians who would, be willing to kind of give up their leadership for their faith. And so I thought that was really inspiring. And I think it's always helpful when you hear somebody say something like, as Christians, we need to jar with culture. And then actually you can see living proof of that in their life. I was really impressed by that. And then the other thing I think we've had sort of glimpses of this throughout all of the episodes from this election series, but I think the way that Tim articulated it was particularly, actually I found quite moving, was when he spoke about this whole idea of, the kind of the fact that every individual is unique and precious, and whether that's somebody that's someone that you agree with or that you like, or is like you. And I thought the examples he gave of, whether that's kind of political or, he made reference, didn't he, to kind of various different situations where actually we might see people and make a judgment on, even if it's subconsciously, of how, I suppose, how worthy they are to be cared for and respected and, I suppose, ultimately loved. And I thought actually, obviously, there was a real Christian message that came through with that. But I thought, again, he was saying that actually disagreeing with people doesn't mean that has to necessarily affect your relationship with them, because actually if you see them on the on the other side of the chamber as again, this is my words, not his, but ultimately as a child of God, actually that reframes the whole way in which you interact with that person, and I suppose the decisions that you might make of what that person, what that person in inverted commas kind of deserves, or so yeah, I thought that was really moving. I was also just fascinated to find out that he had essentially become a Christian thanks to those books that he referred
Yeah.
to in Singapore. And I have to say, even as a Christian, whenever I see sort of, Bibles in hotel rooms or books, in public places, and I think, gosh, surely nobody ever reads those. And that's someone who's a Christian myself. But, there we go. Tim has proved me wrong, that actually not only do people read them, but actually they can have their lives transformed by God working through them. So I thought that was
Yeah. Well, and their lesson, watch what's on your bookshelves.
indeed.
Grace, although we won't put you in charge of the Gideons, I don't think. Maybe let's wait a bit. And so, two questions I have for you, Grace. Well, I suppose the key question is: do you feel more equipped now in terms of how you're going to vote on the 4th of July? Now, of course, I am assuming that you're going to.
Of course, without a
Because
doubt.
I think we would
Yes.
want to say, would we not, that is a necessary part of loving God and loving neighbour as ourselves. But has this helped you, do you think? Do you feel a bit tooled up?
Yeah, I think it has. I think I sometimes find during these kind of election seasons that there's so much information out there that actually sometimes it can be almost, you can feel a little bit overwhelmed with. I mean, I remember just recently, even with kind of local, the elections for the mayor, and the amount of things that we had through the door, and the people who were knocking on our door and things. And actually, I think I really like the fact that from these podcasts we've sort of gone straight, not a very nice phrase, but straight to the horse's mouth, basically, haven't
Yeah,
we?
yeah.
And been able to hear, I'm not suggesting that anyone that we interviewed is a horse, just for clarification, but I like the fact that I think I will listen back actually to the episodes, and I do feel like I've been able to understand a bit more clearly the distinctions between the different parties, and I think, yeah, it's been a very unique situation to then be able to hear about the faith, the foundational faith that informs each of the people. And obviously, not, I'm very aware that not everybody within those parties is obviously Christians, but I think it's been I think that, yeah, the contribution that each of the people we've heard, the MPs that we've heard from, has made has been unique, and I think, yeah, very informative. So I feel much better equipped to go to the polling station on the 4th of July. So yes.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, I think you're right. I think in an election campaign, you can often see the worst of politics, but I think we've had the best. We've had the best of it in terms of the people that we've spoken with, and I think with each there's been real integrity in their desire to relate their Christian faith to their politics, and think carefully about that, and also honestly and critically, and that includes being self-critical of that. My second question, Grace, was how are your plans going for your election party? Are they underway? Do you have
Yeah, still in motion, Paul. You'll be getting your invite at some point.
Excellent, very good. Well, I look forward to it.
It's like
I am
Eurovision
on
all over
tenterhooks.
again.
Exactly. It's better than Eurovision, particularly this year's.
Absolutely. I didn't
Yeah.
have one of those either, to be fair. Well, on that note, if you enjoyed this election special episode of The Whole Life, we would love you to, as ever, leave a review, let your friends know about it, especially in this time where actually I'm sure a lot of people potentially do feel a bit bewildered by the state of our politics. So we hope that, as Paul said, these episodes have been not only interesting, but genuinely really informative as well. Paul, anything that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I think it's been fun doing this little series, and let's now kind of, in a sense, use, I think, some of what we've heard as a lens through which to interpret the remaining days and weeks of the campaign, whenever we're listening to this, and then inform us. And I guess one thing I have thought about actually has been, we rightly expect a great deal from political leaders. We rightly expect that they should articulate a political vision. We rightly expect that they should be honest about the politics and the policies that they think will support that vision. But equally, we should expect, I think, more of us as people, as the electorate. And part of what we should expect from us is that we should engage in election campaigns, that we should think, that we should be thoughtful and prayerful about the way we should vote, and that actually the way we engage with politics should be qualitatively different because of the hope that we have within us. So I think, in a way, that there's a challenge back to us as much as the challenge we presented to the politicians we were lucky enough to speak with.
Yes, it's been a brilliant little extra mini series. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, see you soon. Thanks so much.